There are two portraits of Henry VIII. In the first, painted in 1509, he is 17 years old, 6'2", lean, broad-shouldered, described by the papal ambassador as the handsomest potentate I ever set eyes upon. He speaks 5 languages. He composes music. He jousts. The courts of Europe look at England's new king and see exactly what a monarch is supposed to be. In the second, painted 37 years later in 1546, the same man weighs over 300 pounds. His leg carries an open wound that has not closed in over a decade, so infected that courtiers recorded the smell before he entered a room. He can no longer walk the length of Hampton Court without mechanical assistance. In the previous 11 years alone, he has executed over 70,000 people. 2 of them were his wives. Every historian reaches for the same explanation: the jousting accident of January 1536. A horse fell on him. That is where the monster was made, except the medical records say otherwise. The personality shift, the paranoia, the explosive violence, the cognitive collapse began appearing in documents from 1534. A full year before any horse fell on any king. Something else was happening. Something slower. Something that nobody in the most powerful court in Europe detected, because it was not coming from an assassin in the corridor. It was coming from the dinner table, the medicine chest, the mirror. This is the story of how Tudor England, in its obsession with luxury and status, accidentally built the most efficient poisoning system in European history and aimed it directly at itself. On a cold morning in February 1531, a cook named Richard Rouse walked into the household of Bishop John Fisher and added something to a pot of pottage being prepared for the bishop's guests. Fisher himself did not eat that morning. 17 other people did. 2 of them died. The rest spent days in agony. What followed was not a trial. It was theatre. Henry VIII did not simply execute Richard Rouse. He passed an entirely new Act of Parliament, the Poisoning Act 1530, making murder by poison high treason. The punishment was not hanging. It was not beheading, the mercy reserved for nobility. It was boiling alive, in public, in front of a crowd. Richard Rouse was lowered into a cauldron of boiling water at Smithfield in April 1531 and cooked to death while London watched. What followed inside Hampton Court was the most elaborate anti-poison security apparatus in English history. Royal food tasters employed to eat the king's food first and wait to die. Silver dishes sealed between kitchen and table. Bezoar stones, calcified masses from animal intestines, pressed against cups before drinking. Powdered unicorn horn dissolved into drinks as antidote. None of it worked. Not because the science was wrong, though it was, but because the entire apparatus was aimed at the wrong threat. The poison they feared came from an assassin's hand. What Tudor England never considered was contamination that required no hand, no intention, no conspiracy. The poison that came from the vessel itself. Cadw, the Welsh Historic Environment Service, has documented that Tudor pewter, the most prestigious tableware available to the wealthy, routinely contained up to 10% lead. The Smithsonian Institution has confirmed that acidic foods in contact with lead-bearing surfaces dissolve portions of that lead directly into whatever is being consumed, in quantities a taster would never detect, completely invisible, completely cumulative. Every sealed dish the food taster approved was delivered to the king in a vessel leaching poison into it with every passing minute. They feared the poisoner. They never suspected the spoon. In the Tudor household, what you ate from told the world exactly who you were. The poor ate from wooden bowls. Wood is chemically inert. It leaches nothing. It reacts with nothing. A peasant eating pottage from a wooden vessel was, in this one specific way, safer than the king eating from silver. Below the aristocracy, the merchant class ate from earthenware, clay vessels glazed with lead oxide to create the smooth, glossy finish that signaled quality. The more refined the vessel looked, the more lead it contained. Above them sat the nobility, eating from pewter, and above them the royal court, also eating from pewter, but more of it, more often, at longer banquets, with more acidic food served with greater ceremony. At the pinnacle sat pure silver. And here is where Tudor England made its most lethal miscalculation. Silver was prohibitively expensive. A full silver service was beyond reach for most noble households. So the court ate from pewter, not because they could not aspire to better, but because pewter was the best consistently available at scale. Every step up the social ladder meant more pewter, more often, with more prestigious food that happened to be more chemically aggressive against the metal it was served in. The body does not process lead the way it processes most toxins. It accumulates in bone tissue, where it can remain for decades, slowly re-releasing into the bloodstream throughout a person's life. A Tudor courtier attending royal banquets from age 20 was not simply being exposed to lead at each meal. They were building a reservoir inside their own skeleton that grew silently for years before producing symptoms. Those symptoms were never dramatic. Fatigue, headaches, irritability escalating to rage, memory deterioration, a progressive narrowing of cognitive function that contemporaries described simply as a man becoming difficult or changed. Every one of those symptoms was present in Tudor court medical records. Historians catalogued them for centuries and attributed them to stress, age, divine judgment, astrological influence. Nobody looked at the spoon. Walk into the kitchens of Hampton Court Palace in 1535, and what hits you first is not the smell of food. It is the scale. 55 rooms, 200 staff working rotating shifts around the clock. Over 800 meals produced every single day the court was in residence. Cauldrons so heavy they were suspended permanently from iron hooks above fires that never went out. This was not a kitchen. It was an industrial operation disguised as a household. And every cauldron, every pot, every vessel in which food was prepared at Hampton Court during the reign of Henry VIII was made from bronze or copper. There was no alternative. Tin-lined copper, the safer version, did not become standard in professional kitchens until the late 17th century. Bronze and copper conducted heat evenly, allowed fine temperature control, and looked magnificent. A copper kitchen was a status kitchen. What nobody understood in 1535 was the chemistry of what happened inside those magnificent pots. Tudor haute cuisine was built almost entirely on acidic ingredients. Verjuice, the pressed juice of unripe grapes, sharp enough to make the eyes water, wine reductions, vinegar-based marinades, preserved citrus, fruit-based gravies. The more elaborate the dish, the more acidic its components. When acidic liquid sits inside a copper vessel, especially when heated, the acid attacks the copper surface, dissolving microscopic quantities of metal directly into the food. The longer the contact, the higher the temperature, the more acidic the solution, the more copper enters the meal. Chronic copper exposure at low doses produces fatigue, progressive liver damage, and neurological symptoms including confusion, and mood instability. Exactly the kind produced by cooking acidic food in unlined copper vessels repeatedly over years. Now consider what happened to leftovers. Tudor kitchens did not discard food. Leftover sauces were held and reheated. The same acidic liquid that had already spent hours in a copper pot was returned the following day, reheated and served again, with a full additional cycle of metal leaching added to whatever had accumulated the day before. The most dangerous meal at Hampton Court was not the fresh one. It was the reheated one. The better the cook, the more precisely they poisoned the king. In 1598, a German traveller named Paul Hentzner arrived at the court of Queen Elizabeth I. He had visited the courts of France, Italy, and the Holy Roman Empire. He had seen the most powerful rulers of the 16th century at close quarters. And when he wrote his account of England's aging queen, he noted one detail above all others. Her teeth, he wrote, were black, not stained, not yellowed. Black. And he added, with the careful precision of a man trying to be diplomatic, that this appeared to be a fault the English seemed to suffer from because of their great use of sugar. That single sentence contains more medical information about the Tudor court than most physicians of the period ever recorded. Sugar arrived in Tudor England as something closer to a drug than a food. Available in meaningful quantities to precisely one class of people, the royal court and the wealthiest nobility surrounding it. Sugar sculptures called subtleties were displayed at royal banquets as architectural statements of power, models of castles and heraldic animals constructed entirely from refined sugar, sometimes purely to be seen, never eaten. Proof that the household could afford to waste the most expensive ingredient in England. The lower classes noticed, and they responded by deliberately blackening their own teeth with soot and dye, to signal proximity to the kind of wealth that could afford to destroy itself so visibly. In Tudor England, the physical evidence of slow self-destruction had become a status symbol. Inside Henry VIII's body, the damage was systemic. His personal confectioner operated a dedicated suite at Hampton Court. His dietary records show sweetened dishes at every meal. By the 1530s, he was displaying early signs of metabolic syndrome, the dangerous clustering of obesity, high blood pressure, elevated blood sugar, and inflammatory joint disease. His gout was not simply a product of rich food. Fructose, the sugar in the refined sucrose Henry consumed in enormous quantities, directly elevates uric acid production in the liver. Every sweetened dish was chemically driving the joint destruction that would eventually contribute to his inability to walk. His leg wound, the ulcerated wound that never healed, tells its own story. Chronic hyperglycemia, the elevated blood sugar produced by sustained metabolic syndrome, is one of the primary causes of wound healing failure in modern medicine. His doctors dressed that wound with lead compounds. They were treating the symptoms with the cause. There is a manuscript sitting in the British Library right now that nobody outside academic circles has ever properly reckoned with. It is catalogued as Sloane MS 1047. Among its pages are the actual, surviving, handwritten treatment records for the leg wound of King Henry VIII, the wound that never healed, that his doctors dressed and redressed for over a decade. Read those prescriptions with modern eyes, and what you see is not medicine. What you see is a slow, methodical, clinically precise program of lead administration directly into an open wound on the body of the most powerful man in England. The compounds listed, lead acetate, lead oxide, lead-based plasters, were not fringe treatments. They were the established, respected, mainstream medical consensus of 16th century Europe. The doctors treating Henry VIII were not negligent. They were following the best available science of their era with complete professional confidence, and they were poisoning him through his skin every single time they dressed his wound. What Tudor physicians did not know, what medicine would not formally establish until the 20th century, is that lead is absorbed transdermally, through the skin. And that transdermal absorption through broken, ulcerated tissue is dramatically more efficient than absorption through an intact digestive system. Henry's wound was a chronic, extensively ulcerated lesion with tissue that had lost its normal barrier function entirely. Every lead-bearing dressing was in direct contact with tissue that had essentially no defense against absorption. The lead went straight in, and it went straight to his brain. Now look at the timeline. 1527. First signs of the leg wound in court records. 1530. Lead-bearing treatments documented as standard medical care. 1534. Court correspondence begins recording personality changes. Paranoid suspicion of trusted advisors. Decisions made with speed and violence that shocked courtiers who had known him for decades. 1536. The jousting accident. History's preferred explanation. 1540. Thomas Cromwell, the architect of the English Reformation, beheaded on charges Henry himself later admitted were false. 1546. A man so altered that contemporaries wrote of him as though describing a different person entirely. The jousting accident did not create that trajectory. It landed in the middle of it. Lead neurotoxicity produces exactly what the record shows: a gradual deterioration of the systems that regulate aggression, paranoia, and impulse control. Map those symptoms onto Henry's documented behaviour between 1534 and 1547, and the correlation is not suggestive. It is exact. The most powerful brain in England was being chemically dismantled by the most qualified hands in England, with the most legitimate medicine in England, and not one person in that kingdom knew. While Henry VIII's doctors were administering lead through his wound, the women of the Tudor court were administering it through their faces, every morning, without exception, for decades. The cosmetic was called Venetian ceruse, manufactured from white lead, lead carbonate, suspended in vinegar, pressed into cakes, sold at prices placing it firmly beyond anyone outside the wealthiest households in England. Its effect when applied was precisely what Tudor beauty culture demanded: a flawless, luminous, porcelain whiteness that erased every blemish from the face of whoever wore it. It was also, chemically, one of the most efficient lead delivery mechanisms ever devised. The vinegar used in its manufacture did not merely suspend the lead. It reacted with it, forming lead acetate, a compound that penetrates skin with dramatically greater efficiency than lead carbonate alone. Every application was not simply placing lead on skin. It was placing a chemically activated lead compound against tissue specifically designed to absorb substances into the bloodstream. Elizabeth I applied it daily for over 40 years, and here is where the trap becomes inescapable. Lead compounds applied repeatedly to skin cause the tissue to deteriorate. It thins, its colour becomes uneven. Blemishes appear that were not there before the ceruse was first applied. The cosmetic created the very imperfections it was required to conceal, driving deeper application, more frequent use, higher cumulative exposure, more severe damage, which required still more ceruse to hide. Once inside that loop, Tudor beauty culture offered no exit. Alongside the ceruse on Elizabeth's face, cinnabar rouge on her cheeks and lips, mercuric sulfide, mercury and lead simultaneously, through the same skin, every single day. Mercury poisoning symptoms match Elizabeth I's documented final years with clinical precision. Memory deterioration, withdrawal from public life, refusal to eat, fits of irrational anger followed by extended periods of near catatonic stillness. Eyewitness accounts from 1603 describe her sitting on floor cushions in her chamber, refusing to speak, staring at nothing for hours at a time. The case of Maria Gunning, Countess of Coventry, makes the mechanism impossible to deny. Born in 1733, celebrated as one of the great beauties of her age, she used Venetian ceruse daily. The lead damaged her skin. She applied more to conceal the damage. She died in 1760, aged 27. Her physician recorded cause of death as lead poisoning from cosmetic use. Elizabeth I was inside the same loop for 40 years. There was one final detail. Removing ceruse each evening required a cleanser. Tudor beauty manuals recommended cleansers containing mercury compounds to cut through the lead-based foundation. The morning product poisoned them with lead. The evening product poisoned them with mercury. And the morning product required the evening product to remove it. There was no stage of the Tudor beauty ritual that was not, in modern chemical terms, a toxic exposure event. Catherine of Aragon was pregnant 6 times. 4 produced stillborn infants. 1 produced a son who lived 52 days before dying in his crib at Richmond Palace in 1511. 1 produced a daughter, Mary, who survived. 6 attempts, 1 survivor. Anne Boleyn was pregnant at least 3 times. She produced 1 surviving daughter, Elizabeth, and lost the remaining pregnancies to miscarriage or stillbirth. Her final pregnancy, lost in January 1536, was described by contemporary sources as a deformed male fetus, a detail so politically charged it contributed directly to the charges that sent her to the block 4 months later. Jane Seymour produced the male heir Henry had dismantled 2 marriages and the entire religious structure of England to obtain. Edward was born in October 1537. Jane was dead 12 days later. Edward himself, the boy whose existence had cost more political capital than any birth in English history, was sickly from infancy and dead at 15. 10 pregnancies across Henry's first 3 wives. 1 surviving son who did not survive to adulthood. The Tudor dynasty, which had seized the English throne in 1485 and reshaped the religious identity of an entire nation, ended in 1603 with an aging childless queen sitting on the floor of her palace, staring at nothing. The Kell blood group hypothesis, published in peer-reviewed medical literature, proposes that Henry VIII carried the Kell-positive genetic variant. A Kell-positive man conceiving with a Kell-negative woman can typically produce 1 healthy child. The woman's immune system, sensitized by the first pregnancy, then attacks subsequent Kell-positive fetuses with increasing aggression. The documented pattern of Tudor pregnancies, 1 survivor followed by repeated losses, fits this model across multiple relationships. But the Kell hypothesis addresses genetics. It does not address chemistry. Lead is a clinically established reproductive toxin. Chronic lead exposure in women increases miscarriage rates significantly. It causes placental dysfunction, restricting fetal development. It accumulates in fetal bone tissue because the developing skeleton absorbs lead with even greater efficiency than the adult skeleton, causing neurological damage fatal in the perinatal period. Mercury compounds disrupt hormonal signaling that sustains early pregnancy, cause chromosomal abnormalities, and cross the placental barrier to accumulate directly in fetal tissue. Catherine of Aragon was eating from the same pewter, drinking from the same lead-bearing vessels, consuming the same acidic sauces from the same copper kitchens. Anne Boleyn existed at the center of the same chemical environment that was simultaneously dismantling her husband's brain. Nobody looked at what these women were eating from. Nobody looked at what they were applying to their faces. Nobody looked at what their bodies had been quietly accumulating for years before the pregnancies that failed. The Tudor dynasty did not fail because of bad luck. It did not fail purely because of a rare blood group incompatibility, though that incompatibility was real. It failed because the environment in which Tudor royalty lived, the food system, the medical system, the cosmetic culture, was chemically hostile to human reproduction at every stage. Every resource Henry VIII commanded was deployed in pursuit of a surviving male heir. He restructured the church. He executed wives. He rewrote the law. And while he did all of that, the pewter on his table, the lead in his medicine, the copper in his kitchen, and the ceruse on his wives' faces were working quietly and continuously in the opposite direction. They did not need an assassin. They had become their own. Go back to the two portraits. Henry VIII in 1509, Henry VIII in 1546. You have seen these images your entire life, in textbooks, in documentaries, on the walls of galleries. The story history has always told about them is a story of power, what it does to a man, how it corrupts, how the crown can transform a prince into a monster given enough time and enough absolute authority. That story is not wrong, but it is not complete, because now you know what was in the pewter on his table. You know what was in the copper cauldrons of his kitchen. You know what his doctors were applying to his wound with complete professional confidence for over a decade. You know what his wives were pressing against their skin every morning and washing off every night with something worse. You know what 6 pregnancies produced and what chemistry was operating on every one of them. The story of the Tudor dynasty is not a story of corruption by power. It is a story of destruction by sophistication. Every single thing that marked the Tudors as civilized, as elevated above the people they ruled, was a vector of the poisoning that ended them. The prestige tableware, the elaborate banquets, the advanced medicine, the beauty culture that turned pale skin into political identity. The peasant eating from a wooden bowl was safer than the king. The laborer drinking from an earthenware cup was healthier than the queen. The woman who could not afford Venetian ceruse lived longer than the countess who wore it every day of her adult life. Power in Tudor England was the most dangerous thing you could possess, not because of the enemies it made you, not because of the assassins that Richard Roos's case proved were real and Henry VIII's legislation proved were feared, but because of the table it set, the medicine it prescribed, the mirror it held up every morning and insisted you maintain at any cost. Henry VIII feared poison so completely that he passed a law prescribing death by boiling for anyone who administered it. He employed tasters. He sealed his dishes. He built the most elaborate anti-poison security apparatus in English history around every meal he ate. And then he sat down at a pewter table, ate food from copper cauldrons, drank wine from lead-lined vessels, walked to his physician who dressed his wound with lead compounds, and returned to a court where his wives painted their faces with white lead every morning and removed it with mercury every night. The greatest poison in Tudor England was never in the hands of an assassin. It was in the spoon, in the pot, in the prescription, in the mirror. It was the one they never looked for, because they were too busy fearing the one they understood. If this video changed the way you see one of the most documented dynasties in human history, subscribe, because this channel exists for exactly this reason, to find the layer underneath the layer, the story that was always there in the documents and the prescriptions and the manuscripts, waiting for someone to read them all at the same time. Hit subscribe and do not miss what we cover next.